Studies Forum. My name is Tom Clougherty. I'm the Head of Tax and Editorial Director at the CPS, and I'll be moderating our discussion over the next hour. Our topic today is Power to the People, how to improve consumer protection and promote competition, which, not entirely coincidentally, is also the name of a new report by Penrose MP. John was asked by the Chancellor to review Britain's competition and consumer protection policies, and last week published his independent review. It's a really interesting report with a lot of, I think, very valuable recommendations, and so we're excited to have John here to tell us a little bit more about the report, and then engage in discussion with our panelists and those of you at home. I'll introduce John properly in a few minutes, but let me just mention our other panelists today first. We're going to be hearing from Amelia Fletcher, who is Professor of Competition Policy at Norwich Business School. She's Deputy Director of the Centre for Competition Policy. She's also a Non-Executive Director of the Competition and Markets Authority. Also joining our panel and speaking second after John is going to be Sam Bowman, who is Director of Competition Policy at the International Centre for Law and Economics. He used to be an advisor at Fingleton Associates, advising corporates on competition and regulatory policy issues. And he was also the man brave enough to succeed me as Executive Director of the Adam Smith Institute. So big mess to clear up there, obviously, Sam. Our format is going to be quite simple. We're going to have 5 minutes from each of our speakers and then a broader discussion. Those of you watching via Zoom can submit questions using the Q&A function. For anybody watching on YouTube, I'm told that you can tweet your questions to @CPS Think Tank, and somehow they will find their way to me, and I'll put them to our panelists. John is going to kick us off. John Penrose is Member of Parliament for Weston-super-Mare, has been since 2005. He is the Prime Minister's anti-corruption champion. He's chair of the Conservative Policy Forum, and he was previously Minister of State in the Northern Ireland office. He had a successful career in business before he entered politics. And I think, like all the best people, he grew up in Suffolk, which, funnily enough, is where I am right now. So John, tell us a bit about your independent review of competition and consumer protection policy.
Thank you very much, Tom. And firstly, a huge thank you to CPS for organising this. It's been really interesting in the last couple of days, the number and breadth of different organisations and people who've really got engaged in thinking about where we stand on competition. And you can kind of see why it's piqued people's interest, because here we are just post completing the Brexit process. We are trying to emerge in the process of emerging from a lockdown pandemic. And so if ever we needed to think about microeconomic reforms, supply side reforms, ways that will allow our economy and our businesses to bounce back fast, hard, dynamically, and with huge energy, now is the moment. And it has the huge advantage as well that if you are Rishi Sunak, for example, you have the most enormous queue of people at your door asking for multi-billion-pound handouts to save these group of important jobs in that industry or the following companies in that sector over there, all of which are incredibly important and incredibly expensive. And about the only thing that doesn't cost you a vast amount of money but might genuinely move the dial, economically speaking, are supply-side reforms. So that's why I think the time is now for looking at competition. And there's a further reason as well, which is that we've got now full control. Whichever side of the Brexit debate you were on, if you were a Remainer or a Leaver, the fact remains that however each of us voted, we now have full control of our competition policy and our consumer policy in a way which we haven't had, because large chunks of it has entirely sensibly, when we were members, been decided at the level of Brussels. And so now we can make changes if we want to. And the question is, well, what are we going to do with this extra freedom? How are we going to use it? And the thing which is clear is that actually, Britain's had for decades a pretty good reputation for doing this stuff reasonably well. We were one of the first countries to say, look, we believe that the rule of law should be extended to include things like competition and consumer policy, and to invent and then apply politically independent economic regulators and regulations. and we took politics out of it comparatively early, and therefore Britain's reputation in this area isn't bad. However, it isn't really top-notch at the moment either. We're pretty good, but if you look at the international rankings of competition authorities, for example, America, France, Australia, the EU itself, sometimes Germany as well, tend to rank half a notch ahead of us on many of the indices as well. So we're pretty good, but we could do better, I guess is the point. Equally, if like me, you were pretty worried at the last general election, where we were faced with a Labour Party in particular that was gung-ho for renationalising previously privatised industries on everything from not just rail, which is already partly publicly owned anyway, but broadband and all sorts of other things in the energy sector as well. You realise that actually some of the things that we take for granted in terms of competition and consumer choice are potentially under threat unless we do something to lock them in and make sure that they are permanently and irrevocably and practically working well enough that they stop being a political football and they are something which isn't part of the normal political sandpit in which ambitious politicians will want to play. Wouldn't it be great if these industries were just not part of the political debate because they were basic consumer goods that everybody liked, everybody got on with, and they're no more political than buying jam or coffee or a car or something like that. So there is a huge opportunity here to do better. What are the challenges that we're facing? Well, some of them are to do with just our competition regulators, our competition institutions, where, as I said, they work reasonably well, but we can sharpen them up. We can ask more of them. And many of them are actually gung-ho and ready to step up and do more if we just give them the chance. And that's everything from the Competition Markets Authority, which of course has got a bigger role now because of the powers that have come back from Brussels. But they have a series of asks, particularly around their consumer powers, which are frankly a bit underpowered. And that means that if you want somebody who's going to stick up for consumers and put consumers in the driving seat, make the customer king or queen, give all of us the powers that we expect when we go to a supermarket and we expect to get what we want and to get it in a whole variety of different colours and choices and flavours, and for that to work for all other areas of our economy too, then having good consumer redress really matters. So the CMA's consumer powers matter. Equally, I'm suggesting that the CMA needs to become a sort of microeconomic sister, if you like, to the Bank of England. The Bank of England already has a sort of macroeconomic role in looking after the overall trends of the macroeconomy, but there isn't really an institution at the moment that worries about supply side reform, about the microeconomy, that worries about which sectors are there bad examples, perhaps growing examples of consumer detriment just starting to balloon in this particular area because of particular new practice that is cropping up, and that we should be worried about and we should be trying to fix. No institution tracks that, reports on it, measures it, and tries perhaps to fix it. And the CMA is the obvious organisation to do that. Equally, the sector regulators, which have parallel, concurrent powers with the Competition and Markets Authority, many of them are incredibly forward-thinking and forward-leaning, but again, we can ask them to raise their game. And to my point about trying to make sure that that their sectors that they regulate don't become political sandpits, what I'm suggesting, what I'm asking, is that they come up with a program. In many cases, it will take several years to do, to normalise as much of their industries as they can. If you think of, for example, the energy market, there are a couple of core network monopolies at the heart of the energy sector or the telecom sector or most of the other sectors with an off this or an off that manages them. But outside those network monopolies, where competition is inherently more limited, there's an awful lot of some of those industries which could be normal, which could be ordinary, which could be routine and no different from cars or coffee or cornflakes or whatever it might be. And I think we should be asking them, the sector regulators, to turn those parts of the industries that can be done into normal industries and to hand then responsibility back to the CMA to say, job done. This is a normal industry and you can look after this for the future. And we're just going to be left sitting with the hardcore, the central kernel, the hard nut of less competitive stuff surrounding either the network monopoly at the heart of these sectors, or alternatively some really long-term, difficult, really exam question hard consumer protection issues which still persist. Final point I'll make, and then I'll pass over to my other co-panelists. There are also some really important developing trends which are being caused by the digital development of our economy. And the whole economy is digitizing at the moment, and in general, that's a really good thing. It's made all our lives better. It's brought all sorts of things within reach at lower cost, and geographically within reach, than in ways that people couldn't even have dreamt of 10, 15, 20 years ago. But what it also does, as the downside to all that brilliant new stuff, is it gives fresh legs and fresh opportunities to some quite old-fashioned bits of consumer ripoff, which are morphing and changing and digitizing as well, and which we need to be alive to and aware of. Couple of examples: the loyalty penalty. So if you morph onto, if your contract for anything from insurance through to energy changes and you come to the end of your contract, in some industries, the incumbents will simply use that as an opportunity to move you on to a default tariff, which is far more expensive than you could get if you switched. And that becomes progressively more and more easy for other industries to do because of digitization, because they can tell if you or I are likely to be a price sensitive customer because of the exhaust trail of digital information in which we all leave behind ourselves every time we go online. So the information is out there in a way which didn't exist 5, 10, 15 years ago. It can be either used for our benefit or it can be used for our detriment. We need to make sure that the people who might use it for our detriment don't. That's just one example, but there are other examples where old-fashioned consumer ripoffs are morphing, are changing, and we need to be careful and aware of it. So Tom, I'm going to do something unusual for a politician. I'm going to shut up at this point, pass the back on to someone else, but really happy to either respond to any points that my co-panelists may make, or to respond to questions and comments or concerns from your expert audience as well.
All right. Well, John, that's brilliant. Fascinating stuff. Thank you. And Sam, if we could go to you next, please.
Great. Thanks very much. And thanks to everybody for tuning in and watching. There's a kind of fortuitous contrast today in the Financial Times, which is Andrew Tyrie's letter kind of slamming the CMA. And to me, although I don't expect either of the other panelists to necessarily agree, I think that John's report stands in very favourable contrast to Lord Tyrie's letter. Lord Tyrie's approach seems to be to make the CMA itself popular and visible, and to kind of make the CMA itself a popular sort of body. Whereas I think in John's report, it's very clear that he's focused on the goals and he's focused on the outcomes of competition policy and thinking about what are the various levers that we have in terms of policy that can make the economy richer via competition, not just doing things for the sake of being kind of high in people's minds. And I think the best example of this is Lord Tyree praising the CMA's actions on price gouging during the COVID pandemic, which I think was a really bad step by the CMA. I think maybe was one of the reasons that it was easier to find masks and rice and flour in expensive independent local shops because they weren't so afraid of price gouging laws than it was to find them in supermarkets. And I'm very, very worried about what could happen to the CMA if it becomes more politicized and if it is being given a more expanded remit under the kind of guise of populism. Basically, I think the debacle that Australia has just gone through with the news code and I think the embarrassment that that's brought to the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission has really should be a warning to what can go wrong if we try to get the CMA to do too much. So in the kind of points I want to make and the things I want to talk about, I think the most interesting and most kind of encouraging to me recommendations in John's report relate to this network and data monopolies unit. And this is John's sort of idea for a slightly thinner and slimmer and more focused version of the digital markets unit that the CMA has proposed. And what makes it slimmer is this focus on network monopolies, data monopolies, initially looking at digital markets, and in those markets relating to a more narrow version of strategic market status. So not just a company that sort of functionally acts as a gatekeeper, which would include lots and lots of companies. I mean, Booking.com, for example, is of course a gatekeeper to hotels. It's not necessarily clear to me, even if it becomes very, very large, that it has a monopoly over access to hotels, even if it becomes the #1 destination for accessing those services. And I think that a danger of the strategic market status in the Furman report and in the digital markets unit is that it suffers from the same mission creep and the same growth and extension that all the other sector regulators that we've had so far have suffered from. I think the proposals John makes to say that only with parliamentary consent can a company be given this status and brought under this kind of effective new regulator is a good one. Where I probably disagree or quibble is the idea that data monopolies are a really significant part of the economy right now. I agree with Catherine Tucker, the MIT academic, who thinks that data is not, in fact, inimitable or rare. It's very, very unusual for there to be examples of data where there are true barriers to entry and that it's truly unavailable to third parties. Now, I think click and query data, which is the data that a search engine has when it can see what users are searching for and so can tailor its recommendations, might be an example of effectively having a data monopoly. It's the sort of thing that unless you have a certain amount of scale and a certain number of users, there may be no other way of obtaining that kind of data. But what I worry about is extending that logic to loads of other forms of data and assuming that just because data is valuable and difficult to get, that it's monopolistic and impossible to get. Those are very, very different things in my mind. I'm also quite worried about the idea that interoperability, which is allowing data to be used from one app onto another or requiring it, as the case may be, as a sort of panacea and something we should apply to kind of broad parts of the economy. I'm really optimistic about open banking, which is the most advanced version of data interoperability, one of the most advanced in the world. But it isn't proven yet. It hasn't delivered significant competition benefits yet. It's been costly, it's been difficult. And I think the lesson so far from open banking is that where you do this, you should do it really well. And you should try to pull it off in such a way that really works well for consumers. And I think that takes time and focus. And applying this as a remedy to every single market where there's interoperability or where that could be a feature that customers might use will distract and impose significant costs on people. The bit that I'm really excited about isn't the approach in digital markets, is, as John was just talking about, the approach to network monopolies in regulated markets. And the expression John uses is rebuilding normal competitive markets. And we've gotten to a point where we think of markets where there is monopoly infrastructure as sort of being inherently required to be regulated in almost every way. I mean, you can see this by looking at Ofgem, which has 5 different goals to do with the environment, to do with vulnerable customers, to do with competition, price, quality, safety. All of these things are sometimes contradictory. And I think that it's a kind of passing the buck by the government to say that it's Ofgem's responsibility to promote, for example, environmental outcomes in the energy market, when really what the government should be doing is setting the rules of the game, in this case, I think in the form of a carbon tax, and allowing competition to work within the rules of that game to deliver the outcomes that the government wants. I think it's a subtly different approach that says, look, we can't micromanage how we should decarbonize the energy sector, that nobody knows how to do that. Literally nobody knows how to do that. The only thing we can do is to price in the costs of not doing that to the people who make those decisions and allow market outcomes driven by competition to bring that about. And I think focusing much, much more and perhaps even giving the CMA responsibility for network monopolies rather than the sector regulators, and having a much, much more focused, narrow remit on regulating those monopolies, allowing competition to work, and having the rules of the game set by Parliament, I think could work a lot better. Could give us much more emphasis on barriers to entry and innovation, and could avoid some of the potential for regulatory capture that exists always when you have a dedicated sector regulator. I've gone on for too long, so I'm not going to talk about the third item that I'd love to talk about, which is planning and I think the biggest supply side regulation and most expensive supply side regulation of all. But maybe we can talk about that in the comments. Thanks.
All right, great, Sam. Thank you very much. Amelia, let's hand over to you, but also just remind our audience that you can submit your questions now as we go along, and I will put them to our panelists later. So Amelia, your turn.
Thanks. So I'm just emphasise that although I'm on the board of the CMA, I'm speaking in my individual capacity, not for the CMA, although, and I certainly agree with the kind of Penrose school report for the CMA, pretty good, but could do better. I think that's, you know, almost the best school report. But within, just to start from big, I think within our admittedly small, somewhat nerdy competition world, competition community, this is a hugely wide-ranging and impressive report. I think John has done a really great job at getting on top of a complex set of issues and providing some really serious recommendations. So that's all incredibly welcome. Moreover, despite the faux revolutionary sheen of the report's title and cover, and you haven't shown the cover today, John, but it's bright red and looks all very Marxist. I'm afraid the title reminded me more of Citizen Smith than Marx, but despite that sheen, actually, I think that many of us in the community and many of the people on this watching today should agree with John's overall reading of many of the issues, his broad objectives, and many of his recommendations. And to be fair, he does emphasize that he is very much focused on evolution, in fact, rather than revolution, and that's as it should be. Personally, there's lots in here that I really welcome. I really welcome, and he mentioned it earlier, his support for the independence of competition authorities. I really think that's vital, and I think the consensus around it was starting to slip, and I think it's really important to have a report that sets it very clearly out again how important that is. I'm really supportive of the need to beef up consumer powers, which you also mentioned, and the potential need to extend consumer regulation to cover some sorts of consumer harms that actually we haven't been addressing sufficiently and have got a lot more serious in a digital environment, such as subscription traps and sludge practices. And I can see the benefit of a market investigation into the latter first, which is one of his recommendations. In terms of speeding things up, I support his penalties for non-compliance with investigations and the increased potential for early settlement and commitments in competition cases. And I'm also really pleased with his positive views around the need for pro-competitive regulation of the digital sector. I'll come back to that in more detail in a minute, but I'm very pleased that generally very positive. I was really pleased also in a Brexit environment to see that his emphasis on better regulation and not deregulation. I think there is a huge amount we can do by way of better regulation, but we can do that without the deregulation. So I think that's absolutely the right position to be taking. He didn't mention this earlier, but I really agree that there's a serious need to reboot local trading standards, which are flailing at the moment. I agree with his proposal to set up a task force to review end-to-end processes in competition cases. There's really a consensus that competition cases have got far too big and unwieldy. No one can work out what to do about it. And it's a really thorny issue with lots and lots of tensions. I think some may see John as having copped out on this one, in that this was like, in a way, the exam question, and he didn't actually answer it. But I actually think he did the right thing. I think it's such a thorny issue. Even if he'd have come out with a conclusion, it wouldn't have had the credibility as a group decision recommendation would have. And actually, just by getting agreement and consensus on the problem, I think he's taken us a huge step forward. So I think that's absolutely great. He mentioned this point about wanting the CMA to become a micro sibling of the Bank of England. I'm also supportive of that. I would just emphasize that I don't think we should set our expectations too high in terms of what the state of competition type work that John refers to will ever achieve, in that I think the the macro view of the economy that the Bank of England does is absolutely intrinsic to the key thing that the Bank of England does, i.e. set interest rates. I think the nature of microeconomics is micro. So actually what the CMA is brilliant at is looking at a specific market like electric vehicle infrastructure and thinking, how is this working? Where are all the incentives, even on a local level? And they're really good at that, coming up with recommendations. You cannot do that and that level of detail for everything across the economy. So what the state of competition is it's kind of a macro micro mix. And I think it is a really valuable thing to do. I think someone should certainly do it, and I'm perfectly happy it should be the CMA. I think it should feed into the CMA's thinking, but I just would tone down the expectation that it's kind of going to underpin everything. So but that's all stuff I'm really positive about. I just talk in my remaining minute or so, talk about a few areas I'm a bit more concerned. First of all, in terms of the recommendations around better regulation, while I'm really supportive of the need for better regulation, I do worry that the whole 1 in, 1 out, or even 1 in, 2 out approach is a bit mechanistic and risks doing more harm than good. And I think we can be cleverer. So I would prefer a different approach. I'm not sure how wedded John was to that particular mechanism anyway. On designating digital firms, as Sam mentioned, I am absolutely in agreement with John, and I was on the Furman review, so I'm close to this, that we should be focusing on a very few, very biggest, large digital firms, and we kind of know who they are. And I do also agree that there's a risk of mission creep, and we need to address that risk. And it may be that the criteria that the Digital Task Force have set out do not sufficiently address that. They tried very, very hard, but it is a very difficult thing to do. That said, I'm not sure that parliamentary consent is the right solution, only principally because I just think this is going to be, it's exactly the sort of question where you normally give it to an independent authority and take politics out. And I just think it's going to be a recipe for absolutely mammoth parliamentary lobbying, the like of which you've never seen. And I think I personally therefore think that's not the right solution, but I agree with the problem. In terms of normalizing regulatory markets, again, I agree with that in principle. I do think, and John actually in his introductory remarks made a slightly subtler point than is in the report. I think that my concern would be that the supply side monopoly issues are not the only issues that we see in these utility markets. There's some very complex demand side issues as well. And they aren't fully covered by simple consumer policy, nor should they be. And therefore there is a regulatory role in making those markets work as well as possible for consumers. Could be done by the CMA, but more naturally done by a regulator. But he did in his comments earlier talk about exam question consumer issues, and maybe they fall under that heading. And very last point, on this, you were very positive about the FCA and talked about loyalty penalties. Again, I'm really supportive of measures to address loyalty penalties and indeed the FCA's own action. I would have quite significant concerns about applying precisely the FCA's recommendation, which is for non-discrimination between new and old customers, blanketly across the economy, because I think it could disproportionately harm competition, raise prices, and actually harm consumers rather than helping them. But overall, I don't think this is the end of the journey. I think all of this is great. It's a really helpful staging point with some useful signposts for how to move forward. And I'm very grateful to John for having done it.
All right, well, thank you very much, Amelia. And I think we've got so much food for thought and good discussion there. So let's sort of move to talking about some of these issues in a little bit more depth. And I wonder if I can just go back to John first and then maybe bring Amelia and Sam in. John, you talked about competition policy as sort of, one of the few things that the government can do without spending a lot of money to really boost economic growth. and consumer benefits and so on. So I just wondered, and you've touched on this, of course, already, but if you could just talk us through what you think some of the biggest potential wins are, where competition policy and the kind of approach you've outlined could really improve things and really boost our economic performance.
Sure. I mean, some of them are sector specific. So Sam mentioned earlier on reform of the planning process. I mean, just something which allows much more variety of supply and creativity and building and beauty and bits and pieces like that into the construction sector would be an enormous win, and it would have huge supply side impacts in terms of efficiency of the way that houses get built and the speed at which houses get built, but have great big demand side implications too, because you can just imagine the effects on sky high rents or purchase prices in some parts of the economy that a material increase in supply would have. So there's there are big sector opportunities in one of the others, which I didn't go into in more detail in the report, but I've written on in the past, is in the rail industry, where we have effectively people buying a monopoly. We've called it a franchise, but that's all it is. And now the state has gone back to owning all of those because they all collapsed because no one was on trains at the start of the pandemic. There's a huge opportunity there if we want to take it, to inject get a lot more value for money there. So I think there's huge opportunities, and I would put some at least of the sector regulated sectors into that basket too. Not because necessarily sector regulators are brilliant or awful, but just simply because some of them, there are the material technology changes, which has meant that, as I think Sam mentioned, it's no longer sensible to micromanage the entire sector. You can just let competition run if you set the thing up properly, because large chunks of the energy industry, for example, could be potentially quite competitive now if we set them up the right way. Large chunks of the telecoms market already are, and actually, bless it, the Civil Aviation Authority has already moved, and most of aviation, when it's allowed to actually fly people around, which is obviously a difficult and sore point at the moment, but that they did that, the CAA did that years ago, and the aviation industry is highly competitive in many aspects already. So you can see where those opportunities are if we can but take them. So that's probably a longer list than you were after, but I hope it gives people a flavour about what some of the opportunities are.
No, absolutely. And Amelia, I saw you nodding to much of that, which is always encouraging. I wonder if I can ask you, if the goal is really boosting competition, where would you turn your attention first?
Well, I'm I'm a big supporter of the digital competition work, so I guess it's not a core part of this particular report, but I would very much push for that. I also think that the consumer regulation stuff is incredibly due. It's been under discussion for such a long time. There is consensus, and it just hasn't happened yet. I'm not sure that would entirely drive up competitiveness, but actually I think that the interaction between consumer and competition policy, and the fact that competition is always going to be better when consumers know that they can trust markets, and also the political consensus and the public consensus around competition and markets is much stronger when we have effective consumer policy, makes me very keen on that element as well.
Okay. And Sam, I'll let you have a go at that question, but I wanted to put a slightly different one to you as well. Others might want to comment. But I know that there's been quite a shift in competition policy debate recently. I mean, particularly in the US, it's gone from being something, I suppose, very technocratic to being something which is much more politicized, at least in terms of the way people talk about it. I know there's this term hipster antitrust in the US, but I think what that gets at is the idea that the focus shouldn't be exclusively on consumer detriment, but should perhaps be broader and take, maybe consider that market concentration in and of itself can be a bad thing. I wonder if you want to talk about that and also give us your take on where John's report fits in to these sort of changing dynamics in the discussion around competition.
Sure. A lot of my work is around the US and is to do with that. And I really, reading John's report and in taking part in this conversation makes me think, wow, how good we've got it here. I think there's a very, very, very broad consensus pretty much among everybody, including Andrew Tyree, who is like my kind of whipping boy in all this, that consumers should come first, that consumer welfare is really the point of all of this. And to me, it goes back to Adam Smith. Consumption is the sole purpose and end of all production. Ultimately, we're all consumers, and ultimately the best way of measuring our welfare in a kind of even and equal way that avoids double counting is by looking at consumers. And when we look at the US, often what you see is a kind of attempt to, I think, politicize in a particular way antitrust by the back door, by people who really can't get an agenda brought through via democratic legislative means, who want to use a change to competition and a change to the antitrust standards to kind of get things in that way. So, for example, workers' rights are extremely important. Workers' rights may be weaker in the US than they should be. That's a debate for other people to have on another time. I'm not convinced that if you can't convince Congress of that, and if you can't change the law via democratic means, that it's legitimate to try to change antitrust in a way that increases the kind of weighing that you give to workers' rights at the cost of consumers. So to say, for example, a merger should be blocked because it would lead to job losses that would ultimately increase efficiency and improve consumer welfare. I think that's a very bad, I think it's undemocratic, but I also think it's the route to confusing antitrust and making antitrust something that really has no clarity, ultimately doesn't allow us to use evidence and doesn't allow us to have objective debates about what it's for. And there's a real misconception that people who champion the consumer welfare standard in the US are only non-interventionists or only people who take a kind of dim view of how effective antitrust can be. People like Herbert Hovenkamp, Fiona Scott-Morton, people who are very much in favor of much, much more vigorous antitrust enforcement policy, and in some cases maybe in favor of regulation of the companies that we often talk about here, are all people who think that competition has to be about consumer welfare, because otherwise it just becomes this morass that really doesn't make any objective sense.
Yeah, and John, how conscious of you, how conscious were you of these sort of debates when you were investigating it and drafting your report? Were you being lobbied to come out as a sort of Teddy Roosevelt trust buster? Did you have to sort of fight those tendencies? Or was this sort of always the direction you were thinking?
So yes, I was conscious. I haven't paid as much close attention as for example perhaps Sam has to the warp and weft of the US debate. But yes, I was conscious of all those undercurrents, and I think that Sam is absolutely right to point out that if you start to muddy the waters, if you start to aim at anything other than consumer welfare and reducing consumer detriment, then you kind of miss the whole point and of what competition and consumer law should be all about and policy should be all about. And you also, and this is I think absolutely essential for Amelia's point as well, is that you run the risk of undermining the democratic consent for this stuff in the first place. We only have a free and open economy because consumers ultimately accept that this is a valid way of giving them the stuff they want when they go shopping. Otherwise, you don't get the man on the wall in the street will not pay attention to this. Why would they? As Amelia rightly points out, otherwise this becomes the preserve of nerds and anoraks. Whereas if you get something which is basically, no, everybody understands that their job is at stake. If their company works well, then their job is safe, and if it doesn't, then their job is at risk, and that their welfare is at stake because this is the least bad, the best way of doing things. That's when you get broad-based consensus and broad-based political consensus, democratic consensus behind the whole system. So it's very subtle, but it is absolutely fundamental to an awful lot of what we are as a society, not just as an economy.
Okay. Take a question from the the audience now. I'd be interested in views on this. And it's a point Andrew Tyree made in his letter to the FT today, that the CMA sort of focuses too much on mergers and enforcement actions, and maybe not enough on wider market problems that could have a bigger effect. I mean, Amelia, is that a sort of point of view that you recognise and have sympathy with? Do you think that balance in the CMA's work is slightly off?
It's tricky because obviously the CMA was created as the Competition and Markets Authority, and consumer was kind of explicitly downplayed, although it was continued to have the role, but much more was intended to be done by, I think, trading standards and citizens' advice. And therefore, it sounds a bit like saying the Competition Authority should do less competition enforcement, which is a slightly odd position. On the other hand, I do actually think that we maybe have been doing a little too little market study and market investigation work. And I also think that the CMA, I'm now speaking for CMA, I'm not speaking for CMA, the CMA's consumer work actually is incredibly effective and powerful. But the CMA doesn't actually do that much of it because it's not got an objective to kind of do consumer work, and it doesn't usually get kind of brownie points for doing it, but actually it's really good at it, and the stuff it does is really important. It tends to do the more cross-market stuff that any one trading standard little group would be unable or not in a good position to do. So I'm a bit torn in that I kind of don't want to do less competition and merger stuff, but I do want to do more markets and consumer stuff. So I guess I kind of agree with him.
Yeah. Sam, what's your take on this?
Without commenting on the consumer protection side, where I basically agree with Amelia, I think the trading standard seems to have been really, really let down, and the function of trading standards was really let down under the coalition in particular. What I wish market investigations and market studies were a little bit less shy about doing is looking at structural factors and regulatory barriers to competition. This is the point where I do my little spiel about planning, and I appreciate that John agrees. But it's not just about increasing the price of land by restricting supply. It's obvious why that would restrain competition. It's obvious why that would restrain startups in particular and experimental new entrants. But planning permissions can be weaponized by incumbents. The groceries market investigation, which was done in 2007, so this is a little bit out of date, found that 4 of the big 5 supermarket retailers at the time objected to 9% of grocery retail planning applications. But when you include the unnamed 5th retailer, that 9% rose to 34% of applicants. At least one of these, I think it seems pretty likely, had some kind of commercial stake in preventing new supermarkets being built. And you see this as well in the funerals market investigation, where because of the planning system, because of the need to demonstrate need in an area to build something, crematoria effectively are almost all local monopolies all over the country. Because once you have a crematorium in an area, it's really difficult to come in and say, well, this area needs another crematorium. And the kind of standard is to say that for every, I think, 130,000 people or so, that kind of unit of 130,000 people doesn't need more than one crematorium. And since people usually default to their local one and don't shop around and don't think, maybe I'll go and look at crematoria in North London, not just South London, that can be a huge problem. So what I would love is for the CMA, yes, to take a more broad and kind of holistic approach and to think about kind of market investigations, but to see its role as giving advice to government and using the independence it has to say we're really insulated from politics in a way that pretty much clearly no government ministry is. We can give an independent assessment of the effect of some of these rules on competition and on entry. I think that could be a really, really positive force and could be very, very helpful. Not always welcome help, but helpful nonetheless to the government.
Oh, thanks, Sam. I want to pick up, you've all mentioned trading standards at various points in this discussion. And I want to pick up on part of a question from Mark Boliat. And Mark, I'll do the rest of your question a little later, I think. But he asked, what should we do about trading standards? And is part of the problem that we have local trading standards, but we're trying to deal with national issues in many cases? is that model of local trading standards offices one for the past and we need something better now? Or is it something that can be made to work? John, why don't we go to you first on that one?
And I think the answer to both those questions is yes. Yes, we absolutely do need local trading standards, because you will get local trusts, you'll get local oligopolies, and you'll get local consumer detriment cropping up because somebody's misbehaving in the local estate agency market or the local builders firms or whatever it might be. So you've got to have that available for local detriment of one kind or another. But also, and this is where I would encourage Amelia to not lower expectations about what the CMA's role could be in terms of taking this overall view of what consumer detriment looks like as a sort of microeconomic, the sibling idea to the Bank of England. You also need somebody who's then going to say, right, we've got all these trading standards organisations plus the local citizens advice bureau offices all the way around the country, et cetera, et cetera. We need to raise the game for the trading standards offices that have been hollowed out. Some are excellent incidentally, but some have been hollowed out and need to be improved. And then you need to have somebody at a national level that's stitching all that together and saying, right, now what's the pattern here? What are we observing? Is this actually just a problem with estate agencies in Hull, or are we seeing it in Merseyside and in Greater Manchester and in Greater Bristol as well? And actually, is there a systemic problem or a broader problem than that happening too? And that's why I think the CMA's role here could be really helpful, because they are the ones who have access to this information. They can piece the pieces together, and if they publish it regularly, it provides an evidence backdrop for their strategic decisions about saying, right, we're going to do a market study into this sector here or into that part of the country there. And it will show people that that actually people have got their backs. That if there is a problem with crematorium monopolies in wherever it may be, to Sam's point, that somebody notices and somebody cares and it gets fixed. And that's the thing which doesn't happen enough at the moment. And that's the thing. There's a difference between trust in the system, both Amelia and Sam have talked about that, and faith. I don't want people to have faith. I want them to trust it because they can see it happening. They can see it working on a daily basis. And that's what we're missing at the moment.
Amelia, the rest of Mark's question, which sort of fed into that trading standards point, was whether it was a big failure of consumer protection policy that some of the, I guess, some of the sectors where there've been sharp practices and real consumer detriment have been quite hard for regulators and competition authorities to reach. And he mentions car servicing and estate agency as two examples. There are probably lots of other ones where there are many sort of small businesses working at a local level, sort of without the kind of oversight that we've been discussing for big businesses. Is this just too difficult to deal with? And if we try and deal with it, is it going to be heavy-handed and do more harm than good? Or is the approach John is outlining, a realistic way forward in those hard-to-reach areas?
So I agree with John about that as a good example of where the microeconomic sister role could be very useful. I also think that there is an issue with consumer breaches of consumer law at a local level in some of these markets. However, I think that is exactly where a better, more effective trading standards would be very valuable, because that is where it's usually local, small scale breaches within a clear set of rules. So I think that absolutely the better trading standards would address that. Where I think the CMA could have a role is, first of all, helping, yes, as John says, kind of helping in that direction process and getting better information out about kind of who's doing what. But in terms of bringing its own cases, what it can do really well is do market investigations into markets where maybe the rules aren't actually quite right. So it has in the past done investigations, or the OFD did, into estate agents and into car servicing to particularly examine whether the existing legislation was fit for purpose. So that's a really key role it can do. And in terms of the consumer intervention. So actually bringing cases, what it can do is bring national cases where particularly precedent setting cases, or where a particular behavior is done by a national or even global firm. And actually one of the concerns, we've talked about kind of Brexit bonus. One of the possible risks around Brexit is that some of the consumer cases against the biggest digital firms were being done on a coordinated basis across Europe. And the CMA was playing its role in that. And I really hope that we can continue to achieve that kind of coordinated approach, because actually these big guys, global firms, we're trying to regulate them on the competition side, but there are really big issues on the consumer side, and the more we can work with other authorities to bring cases, the better, as well as making sure that the law is in the right place in the first place.
Okay, Sam, I want to direct a question to you from my colleague James Haywood, and he's asking about the sort of effect where people on lower incomes don't benefit as much from competition, maybe because they're less likely to switch providers or tariffs or whatever. Do you think there are policies that can realistically address this issue of poverty premiums? And if so, what would they be?
Yes, and I think this goes directly to the loyalty penalty question as well. And this is an area where I'm really optimistic about interoperability. I'm less optimistic about interoperability for Instagram, very much for people's smart meters, because I think what is happening to a lot of people is that because they lack time, they lack the ability to spend hours searching, and the knowledge of how much they're using, they often just get locked into very, very bad tariffs for energy, for mobile phones, mortgages, whatever, and just don't know that switching would benefit them. And what really we're having there is a failure of middlemen. What we really need there is an informational middleman who can step in and do that work for them. It's not about educating people more. It's about them not having to do that education or learn about that kind of thing. So where I think that there's a huge amount of potential for something like open banking is, I've written a report on open energy, allowing people to share their smart meter data with approved third parties. Because what I think that could do is both allow trusted intermediaries, and the trust is really important there, because you don't want kind of shysters coming in and basically just performing the same role and kind of themselves taking advantage of people. But companies like, for example, Monzo or Google, or companies that have a reputational stake in not exploiting customers, where really the money for them is not worth the perception of exploiting those customers, but having customers feel like those companies are saving them a huge amount of money is a massive boon to them, could step in, look at the smart meter data that people are using, look at the kind of when they're using energy, how they're using energy, and both switch them to tariffs that are more suitable to them. And electricity is a really, really good example, because actually the way the time you use electricity is massively important to the cost to the company. And also help people change their habits by suggesting products that might work for them, by suggesting, turn your immersion heater on at 4 o'clock in the morning rather than 7 o'clock in the evening. I don't think this will happen overnight. I don't think we should expect that there's a quick, easy remedy to this. And I actually think that we have to tolerate, and this is one thing I disagree with in John's report. I'm really, really worried about any kind of attempt to prevent pricing to incentivize people to switch, pricing that basically takes advantage of price discrimination, because I think in the long term that's pro-competitive, and in the long term that's output enhancing. But what we should be doing is reducing the barriers to people engaging in that, and reducing the barriers to middlemen stepping in and doing it for them.
Thanks, Sam. I want to close, so we've got about 5 minutes left, with putting a question to you all about the government's better regulation strategy. But before we do that, I wonder if, John, I can just ask you something which has come up in the comments here. I sort of love your idea that the sector regulators should really be given a mandate to make themselves redundant, or at least as redundant as they possibly can be, by normalizing the markets that they work in. But I am struck that, as I understand it, this was the goal of the original set of economic regulators and the people who set those economic regulators up, that they weren't meant to be forever institutions. They were meant to sort of transition from nationalized to competitive markets and then go away. So what do you think we can do to make it different this time? Is it simply a matter of political will?
So a really fair question. I think that the that the original, I mean, it's before, I think, all our times, but I think the original idea that the regulators could sort of, evaporate in a puff of smoke after a couple of years was always intellectually actually quite flawed, but because of these network monopolies. At the core of every single one of these previously nationalized industries, there's a network monopoly. And so you're always going to have a bit of it, this sort of hard core, this hard nut at the center, which is going to be less competitive and inherently so, and will require a different treatment. So I think it is worthwhile going back to it. And I think it is worthwhile going back to it because of two reasons. One is that, as I said, for some of these industries, some of them much more than others, there's a really big opportunity because the network monopoly is just a small bit and there's an awful lot of the rest of it which could be normalized. And we should ask them to do that. That is entirely reasonable. And yeah, we should just give them the mandate and let them get on with it and require them to do it. And I don't think we should accept no for an answer. So that's an element of just framing it properly, creating the political will, and then letting good people get on with the job. But I think also the other point is the point made by Jason Furman in his Furman review, and he's absolutely right. No monopoly is necessarily eternal. They may change slowly, and it may take a technology change to make them start to erode. But there's all sorts of things we can do to reduce the anti-competitive effects of even the most deeply entrenched and long-standing network monopoly through things like interoperability where it applies. I take Sam's point; it doesn't work in every case. There's all sorts of things we can do to reduce the barriers that are inherent in these things, and we should do that too, in order to make sure that even where we can't get really good competition, we can at least get fairly good competition, pretty good competition, and I think that should be front and center and the primary aim for all these sector regulators wherever possible.
All right, thank you, John. And let's so as I said, the sort of final topic I'd sort of like you to address, it comes from one of our questions, is the government's better regulation strategy, and whether it's 1 in, 1 out, 1 in, 2 out, the business impact target, or whatever form it takes. So the question, John, was specifically, I think, to you, and about whether you think it's realistic to have no exceptions to those kind of regulatory targets. That personally is my view as well, but the commenter points out, if you look at Grenfell and building safety and so on, aren't there inevitably going to be carve-outs from those sort of regulatory approaches? And so I wonder if John, you can address that. I know Amelia doesn't really like the 1 in, 1 out things you mentioned before, so I'll give her a chance to perhaps talk about her preferred approach to a better regulation strategy, and then we'll come to Sam. But John, if you want to take that one first.
Yeah, sure. So the danger with carve-outs is that the moment you accept the principle that you might allow one, Sir Humphrey Appleby can relax. The whole business of Whitehall and Westminster is to invent new rules. That's what we do, and that's how you make your career. That's how you progress. It doesn't matter if you're a civil servant or an elected politician. That's how you make your bones. And if you don't do it, you don't progress. And the whole system is geared up in that direction. The moment you accept that something shouldn't be subject to that discipline, then basically the available loophole will expand to encompass pretty much anything. The latest set of proposals, which were published about a month ago now, allow 13 different exemptions, one of which is anything to do with net zero. Now, net zero is really important. I mean, I'm totally on board with net zero, but we shouldn't say that because it's important, we shouldn't try and do it in the most cost-efficient, most least expensive way possible. We're talking about how, not if. And the moment you say something's too important, building safety, Grenfell, absolutely right. You cannot possibly step back from the standards that are required in order to deliver building safety. But I think it is absolutely essential that we do that in a way which makes it less expensive to deliver high quality and more expensive to deliver the same high quality. Otherwise, we'll just end up with fewer things being built because it's punishingly expensive to build them in the first place. Why can't we do it in a way which is cheaper and still achieving the same standard? It's the difference between better regulation and deregulation, in other words, which I think we've all mentioned up front and before. And so therefore, it's absolutely essential that we don't allow exemptions. One of the old exemptions that used to exist was anything that came from Brussels when we were still an EU member was exempt from better regulation. and it can't be a coincidence that, again, whichever side of the Brexit divide everyone was on this call, one of the things that was a powerful weapon for the Brexit side was saying it's horribly bureaucratic, and nobody pays any attention to this stuff. We will come and solve it. Now, what would have happened if that had been solved in advance? Who knows? But I think it shows the danger of allowing Sir Humphrey Appleby to have any kind of carve out if you can possibly avoid it.
John, thank you. I'm going to come back to you in a second for a final thought, but maybe if we can first get final thoughts from Amelia and then from Sam. If you want to address that better regulation issue that we've just been talking about, go ahead. But if there's something else you want to get off your chest before we close this discussion, now's your chance. So Amelia, you first.
So I think just to say on the better regulation point, it's just very hard. So if you think about the FCA at the moment, in trouble for things on the perimeter, like mini bonds not being properly regulated, buy now, pay later not being properly regulated, you see immense consumer harm associated with those. There's a big clamour for greater, widening the perimeter to address them. Then the question is, well, what do you take out? Likewise, in this very report, John has suggested we need to extend consumer regulation. I don't think that he's got any recommendations for things that we should take out. So what I feel is it's not kind of one in, one out, or maybe he does, but actually it's about doing what we do in a much more business friendly way. I think you can do financial services regulation, for example, in a way that is clunky, that requires all sorts of disclosures and all sorts of checking with all sorts of people, or you can do it, and John talks about this, in a much more outcome focused way that is much more business friendly and still should hopefully achieve the same aim. So I'd say less on counting numbers, rely more on CBAs, cost benefit analyses, than one in, one out, but trying to do smarter regulation rather than, and that's what I think of as better, smarter rather than just less.
Okay, thank you, Amelia. Sam, final thoughts?
Yeah, on this point, I think there are two problems with any kind of better regulation initiative, and the reasons I'm kind of cynical about these things. The first is that when you have regulations, because we're naturally loss averse, and because a lot of the businesses that have emerged to grow around those regulations, any attempt to remove them will bring people who can only see the downsides, and see incumbents who really don't want to see new entrants. They have an active stake in not allowing more competition to take place, and those really are the only ones that exist. So this is why I'm unbelievably pessimistic about any attempt to improve regulation by talking to business, because the businesses that exist right now are the ones that don't want to deregulate, because really we should be making their lives hard by deregulating, by bringing in competitive new entrants. And that's the second problem, which is that we don't see the costs of the regulations, because the biggest costs are to do with innovation and to do with new company formation, and it's the unseen cost of these things. So a kind of small idea that my old boss John Fingleton has, and that I think is a very good idea, is the idea of a sort of cross-sector sandbox. He calls it an N+1 regulator, where you say maybe we should have an insurance-based system where a government regulator gives us a 5-year license to promising new startups, says, for the next 5 years, most of these regulations don't apply to you. Health and safety ones probably do, but even then, if you can make a good case for it, we can give you a break, provided you can either get insurance or pay us for the insurance to cover third parties who are injured by what you're doing. I don't know that that would work, and the point wouldn't primarily be to create new startups that can bypass regulation, because eventually they're going to need to go out into the big wide world, and they should be regulated in the same way that the rest of the economy is. This isn't France. But what we should be doing is learning from the pressure points. And if we can spot the companies that are being formed, and if we can spot that there are regulations that are consistently needing to be exempted from by these new companies, then that might give us a kind of tiny view into the unseen kind of hidden costs of regulation. I'm not certain this will solve all our problems, but I think it could give us more information than we've got right now. And it's a lot better than listening to whatever the CBI has to say.
Sam, thank you very much. John, last word.
A very quick last word, since we're talking about better regulation. I would completely agree with Sam that the costs of regulation are usually, in terms of lost creativity, are the ones that are hard to spot, and the people who shout loudest are the ones who have got the biggest stake in the status quo. However, I think that we can do something here by and give the process a whole lot more teeth, just by saying to ministers, you can't have any more rules until you've come up with the two out that you've got to come up to match the one in that you're creating. So if you are the minister for paperclips, you're not going to be allowed to have your new rule about paperclips until you found two others to get rid of. And to Amelia's point, Amelia, I think you and I may be just having a minor argument about accountancy here, because I'm talking about the cost of it in pounds, not the number of regulations. Otherwise, I would offer up the Witchcraft Act as one of my one out, which is of course entirely irrelevant nowadays. You have to do the costing. You're absolutely right, Amelia. But if you do that and you say to ministers, you can't have your new law, it doesn't get introduced to Parliament until you found the two out, I think it also helps to answer some of Sam's concerns, because he's right. Business can help come up with some answers, but they'll only come up with some. You've got to have producer pull. You've got to have the machine, the engine, the Whitehall and Westminster machine actually coming up with some of the answers to itself. You give them the incentive by saying you can't do what gets you a promotion unless you can come up with your two out. And at that point, it becomes a game changer. And at that point, we get the CBI and ministers and Sir Humphrey Appleby all on side. And that really would be a game changer.
John, thank you again very much. Congratulations on your report, and we look forward to seeing how it gets translated into hard policy. I've been a bad chairman and let this overrun ever so slightly, but I think that's a testament to how interesting our panelists have been and how important some of the issues we're discussing are. So if we were all together, I'd raise a big round of applause, but for now, you'll just have to take it from me. We really appreciate you all being here. So thank you, Amelia, Sam, and John. And those of you watching, if you enjoyed it, we have many more events like this. Go to our website and sign up, follow us on Twitter, get our email bulletin, and so on and so forth. Otherwise, I hope everyone has a wonderful evening and look forward to seeing them on one of these Zooms soon. So thank you again.
Thanks a lot.